Today we're putting two iconic small blocks battled against each other. The 350 out of my 91 Camaro against the more common 2006 era LM7 out of Silverados. Now, the thing is, people are questioning, what should I put in my car? What's the most bang for the buck? What's the best thing I can do for daily driving? Well, today we're going to dive into that, take a look into what you should be running in your vehicle. It's no secret the small block 350 has been the cornerstone of hot rodding since the 1950s. Now, by 1991, the Z28 came with a completely different package than what was available on like the 1950s, 70s, and 80s cars. Now, at this point, they're running tuned port injection, though most people have taken this off in favor of a carburetor or stealth ram or anything else really, because the TPI is fine, just good for low-end grunt. It does have cast iron 083 heads, and the camshaft was built for emissions more so than actually like enjoying the car. For the factory, is rated at 245 horsepower and 340 foot-pounds of torque, which not bad, but really it all kind of runs out of steam before 5,000 RPM. Now, looking at the LM7 on the other hand, this started showing up in trucks in the early 2000s. It's a 5.3 versus the 5.7 and the 350. Now, this is a Gen 3 LS. It's not flashy. It's cheap. It's got a lot of power. Pretty efficient. The factory ratings were about 285 horse, 325 pounds of torque. On paper, yeah, it's definitely smaller than the small block, at about that 327 size. But it revs out cleaner, makes more power, much more efficient, and it just responds better to mods. Now, there's a reason for that, so let's dive on into the bones of each of these and see why each of these are kind of what they are. Now, looking at the architecture of each of these, the 350 is the traditional Gen 1 small block. That's cast iron, 2-bolt, sometimes 4-bolt main, simple HEI ignition, easy to work on, parts are everywhere. It's just one of those things. It's super easy to work on because everybody's done it. The LM7 is the Gen 3 design of the small block, still iron, but it does have 6 mounting points for the mains. Now, that is a much stronger bottom end, and that's why we're seeing much more power out of these things with turbos and things like that, out of, SBE, stock bottom end. Each cylinder has its own coil. It's sequential EFI, cathedral port heads. I mean, really, the flow numbers are significantly different. So let's dive on into that next, because that's really where you're going to see your differences and the big gains and why the gains are what they are. Now, talking cylinder heads and camshafts is really where these two engines diverge. The 083 heads or 113 heads, pretty much like the best for this era of small block, at least our segment of Vortec heads. But we're looking at flowing 180 CFM at half an inch lift. That's just abysmal, by today's standards. And at the time period, it was pretty good. But at 5,000 RPM, just kind of capping out because of how the head set up with the cam. The head and the cam is really where these engines start to kind of split off from each other. The Z28 right here has got the 83 heads. They flow about 180 CFM at about half an inch of lift. It's not terrible, but it's definitely behind the standards of today's engines. This is a big reason why at 5,000 RPM it really starts to kind of choke out, and the cam doesn't help either. Now, the cam is usually a 202 at around 4/10. So, it makes torque way down low, but up high, it just kind of chokes itself out, and that's not great for hot rodding. The LM7 uses 862 or 706 heads. These are known to flow at about 225 at about that same half an inch. The cam is also much more mild. It is around 198 duration, 196, 191, depending on what engine you've got. The lift is higher at about half an inch, 466. So it does take advantage of the airflow, but the bigger thing here is just raw head flow characteristics. It's able to move much more air at all of the ranges, whether high or low, in the lift band. Now, the thing is, nobody leaves these things factory. Why would I set up a 350 small block or an LM7 and just drive it around factory? That's not what we're here for. For the 350, typically what I'm seeing in my builds are built around here. Something like a Blueprint or the H8002K series, they're like $1,500 a set. They're going to flow like, 240-ish. So it's a significant gain over the standard small block. And it puts it right in line, if not just a hair better than that LM7. Pairing that with like a 224, 232 cam at like half an inch, just over half an inch lift, in a dual plane carb, you're at like 330, 360 horsepower. It's not crazy, but 380 pounds of torque definitely makes the thing move. The nice thing with third gens is they're pretty light in the grand scheme of things, so a lot of torque really isn't necessary like it would be in more modern Camaro chassis or Magnums, Chargers, newer Mustangs. Now, the LM7, what you can do though is just throw in a sloppy stage 2 cam and make 370 to 400 wheel. It's rowdy, it revs out high, it starts every time you turn the key, it just runs. And usually you're pairing that with a much more modern transmission as well. You can either go with like a 4L80 or a 4L60. Personally, the 4L80 is the way that I would almost always go. Yeah, it's heavier, but it is a much more robust transmission. And it's going to last when you start beating the crap out of it, because that's why we build these things. Now, there is a factor here, which is the street and the track. The 350 with heads cam has pretty instant throttle response. You roll into it, the car feels like it wants to actually move. A lot of torque offline, great mid-range, but by the time you're actually like in the long part of the second gear and the 700R4s, you're really starting to kind of get full, pushed behind. But the initial torque is phenomenal. It's great for 60 foot, but again, eighth mile, quarter mile, you start kind of getting caught those more modern transmissions. The LM7 it feels different. It's not quite as violent down low. It doesn't have that just bam hit off the line unless you turbo, nitrous, all the things that it really enjoys. Once you hit like 4,000 RPM though, you notice that it keeps pulling. As where the small block with the dual plane really wants to kind of start fading off at that period. The LM7 doesn't just nose over, it carries horsepower all the way to like 6,500 RPM. On the street, this essentially means to you that the car is more fun to drive with a small block. The car is more effective and usable with an LM7. Now, it's just one of those things where you're going to end up at like a 12.8 to a 13, with the small block, but with that same setup, as far as like cam and essentially head flow goes, you're going to be like 12.5, 12.4 to 12.7, and you're definitely going to trap a little bit faster in that LM7. So really, the LM7 is going to be the faster car more often than not. But, the feel, a lot of times, is why we build these cars. Just the fun of it. We're trying to build these things to actually enjoy the vehicle. And inside of that comes reliability and the upgrade ceiling. The small block Chevy is just dead simple. Carb, HEI, no electronics, easy to tune the screwdriver. You can just find parts at any AutoZone. But it does require a little more babysitting. You're going to be sitting there doing seasonal tuning, jet changes, fuel pressure changes, things like that. You're going to be looking at all sorts of different things. You're going to have some hot start issues. You're going to have limited airflow versus the EFI setups. You're going to be kind of pushing that thing to about that 400 horsepower point, and that's where the 2-bolt mains like to end up just kind of giving up the ghost. Now, the LM7 has the distinct advantage of those 6 bolts holding in the entire rotating assembly. So boost wise, it's crazy. You can get to 600-700 horsepower wheel without opening the thing up necessarily. And if you've got one that already has kind of showing some blow by, you might actually be in luck, because those things tend to actually run really well with boost. And the stock PCM, you can adjust fueling, timing. You can use that really throughout the entire build process. You don't have to go Holly. You don't have to go Phytech. You can just stay inside of that factory harness you pulled out of a truck that you bought for $3,000. If you want to daily the vehicle and you want to be able to get 24 miles to the gallon, the LM7's it. I mean, it really is. The carburetor setups, I've gotten 10, 12, 14 on a good day. And that can come down to tuning, that can come down to driving. But, we are, again, building these things to beat the crap out of them. And all of that kind of being said, the small block I've got here really is kind of the soul of the car. It's the torque, sound, the analog feel, Makes the car feel like a muscle car rather than a modern sports car. The LM7, if you want just raw speed, you're building a car for just straight up drag racing or taking on long drives, that's your choice. But if I'm going to go to a car show, go hit the track real quick, the small block Chevy's going to be fine. If your goal is nostalgia, old school attitude, small block. The cams just sound different with the carburetor, and the bigger lope. It's just a different feeling and sound of the car. The LM7 is going to have much better track numbers. It's going to have cleaner under the hood potentially, depending on how you wire it. It's going to have more boost potential. But at the end of the day, for me, it's not necessarily about being just fast. It's about actually enjoying the car. I've got the ability to go ahead and throw nitrous on something and make much power, but that's just not what I'm after in a vehicle. Now, if you enjoyed this discussion, comment down below and let me know what engine you'd want in your car, or what one you do have in your car and why you're keeping it or changing it. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We're going to be putting out a lot more videos here shortly. I've got about 20 sitting in queue, so good luck, guys. Have fun on the road. I'll see you out there.